Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jahmyr Gibbs, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be mentioning my top 36 ranked running backs, along with giving you guys my thought process and opinions and the statistics that justify these current rankings. Now, a couple things to keep in mind as we go throughout today's video. Every statistic that I mention is for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Another thing to keep in mind, rankings are subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there is going to be a lot of information regarding injuries, whether it's running backs or even offensive linemen, that is going to be made apparent and public to us that could absolutely change these overall rankings. So for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings and content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship, so be sure to do so today. Now, like I mentioned, between now and Sunday, there's going to be a lot of changes. On Sunday mornings, like I do every single season, Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel. So for those of you who are trying to stay up to date, be sure to go ahead and join us there. Now, for those of you who are not able to make it, but still want additional advantages over the course of the 2023 season from weeks 1 through 18, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you get a first-time deposit match that you can use for either best ball draft or potentially some pick'em slips. We'll talk about that in just a moment. You can also get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide if you haven't drafted yet already, but also you will get weekly rankings from my email to yours every single Sunday morning, half PPR, full PPR, by position, by tier, in order to help you set your lineups. So be sure to take advantage of the opportunity today. Like I was mentioning, you can go ahead and use that first time deposit to play the pick'ems game, picking, higher or lower on a given player statistic. As of this upcoming Thursday, the kickoff between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Detroit Lions, we have Patrick Mahomes at 0.5 total yards. Utilize that freebie inside of a pick'em slip, and of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. So for those of you who want those rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, be sure to go ahead and use code Andrew. Make that first time deposit. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, the map on the right side of the screen will determine your eligibility based on your location. And for those of you who are not eligible, or perhaps have been in a situation where you've already utilized code Andrew or somebody else's code and made that first time deposit, you can also find all these rankings via my Patreon down in the description. Thank you very much. Last thing I wanted to mention, of course, the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel, is now live. For those of you interested in supporting the channel and of course repping, greetings and salutations, you can travel down to the description, find AndrewKirchhoffShop.com, and go ahead and support the channel that way. Again, we're making high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays. So rep the channel. Thank you for the support. I appreciate it. All right, let's get into talking about our week 1 running back rankings. Of course, we want to start our studs. Therefore, I will begin with Christian McCaffrey taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers this upcoming week as my #1 overall running back. As soon as Christian McCaffrey joined the San Francisco 49ers, in the games in which he played 50% or more of the offensive snaps, including the playoffs, he was averaging 20.31 half PPR fantasy points per game, averaging over 15 touches per game, and of course, 6 targets and 5 receptions per game. His overall utilization within this offense was workhorse level, and we're going to continue to see that utilization in 2023. I know that there's conversations regarding Elijah Mitchell. He's going to be active and healthy. When Elijah Mitchell has played with Christian McCaffrey, specifically last season, in those games, Christian McCaffrey's about playing 67% of the offensive snaps, getting himself 17.2 opportunities, which is a combination of rushing attempts and targets, 16 touches per game, and 14.4 fantasy points per game. I truly do think, yes, there is going to be the impact of Elijah Mitchell, but it's not going to be significant enough for me not to start Christian McCaffrey as my #1 going into the Pittsburgh matchup. Moving on. Let's talk about Austin Ekeler, our #2. Now, Austin Ekeler takes on the Miami Dolphins this week, and we had the privilege of seeing these two teams take each other on last season in week 14, where Austin Ekeler scored 20.4 half PPR fantasy points. He didn't find much success in terms of rushing yardage, but of course, 8 targets, 8 receptions, and had himself a bunch of receiving statistics, which of course elevates his game every single week. This is a running back that, of course, typically is going to find the end zone and is always going to have receiving upside. So regardless of the fact that the Miami Dolphins last season were the second best team in terms of allowing yards per attempt to opposing running backs, only allowing 3.7 last season. Now, this matchup between the Miami Dolphins and Los Angeles Chargers is going to be a little bit different because the coordinators are changing going into this matchup in comparison to last season. Of course, the Los Angeles Chargers have a new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, and of course, the Miami Dolphins have a new defensive coordinator, Vic Fangio. The last time those two took each other on was Dallas versus Denver in 2021, and Dallas got shut out in the first 3 quarters of the game. And it led to, of course, the Denver Broncos mounting a giant lead and pretty much winning that game. Obviously, there was a lot of sketchy play calling in that game because the Dallas Cowboys went for it twice on 4th down in the first quarter, and it absolutely burned them. Nonetheless, I truly do believe, with Austin Ekeler, his receiving upside, his touchdown upside, he's an automatic play. Moving on, let's talk about Nick Chubb taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. This is a division rival, so they'll have multiple opportunities taking on the Cincinnati Bengals defense. But over the course of the last 3 years, since 2020, in the games in which the Cleveland Browns and Nick Chubb have taken on the Cincinnati Bengals, the first of their 2 matchups in that given season, Nick Chubb goes off, averaging 26.67 fantasy points per game. And in those last 3 games, had a base minimum of 100 plus rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in each of those contests. So in a given year, when you take on the Cincinnati Bengals twice, that first time that he takes them on, whether that's in week 1 or week 7, week 13, doesn't matter. Nick Chubb always gets an incredible game off the rip against the Cincinnati Bengals defense. He has shown that over the course of the last 3 seasons. Additionally, last year when they took on this defense in week 8 and in week 14, in week 8, the overall running back contributions of the Cleveland Browns combined for 35.8 fantasy points, of course, 160 plus rushing yards, got a lot of receiving work from Kareem Hunt, and now that Nick Chubb is the only running back that, in my opinion, is going to deserve touches out of this backfield. I know we'll see Jerome Ford, probably get a couple touches here and there, but as a full workhorse back with receiving upside, Nick Chubb is an automatic play. Moving on, let's talk about Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard, again, takes on the New York Giants. And over the course of his career, specifically last season, in the 2 matchups against that division rival, he had 31 attempts for 165 rushing yards, a 5.32 yard per carry average. Now, despite the fact that he was hyper efficient in that overall matchup, in the 2 games in week 3 and in week 12 that they took on the New York Giants, Ezekiel Elliott scored both of the rushing touchdowns in those games. So unfortunately, we didn't see Tony Pollard have himself incredible success, but now there's no Zeke. There is no other running back that is going to impede on Tony Pollard's rushing upside in the red zone. Last season, in the 2 matchup against that defense, the Cowboys running backs combined for 24.5 fantasy points in week 3 and 23.1 fantasy points in week 12. I expect Tony Pollard to have himself an incredible week against the Giants defense. Moving on to the A tier, we begin with Bijan Robinson, the rookie running back. He takes on the Carolina Panthers, another division rival. So when we saw Desmond Ridder become the starting quarterback of this organization from weeks 15 through 18 of last season, this team was running the ball with their running backs 31 times per game and targeting their running backs 6.75 times per game. The volume of opportunity that we were witnessing is hopefully going to continue going into this upcoming season, especially with week 1. You want to go ahead and use your new toys, and specifically, Bijan Robinson is that for the Atlanta Falcons. Give him as much opportunity as possible, because last time we saw this offense take on the Carolina Panthers, specifically last year, even though Marcus Mariota was a starting quarterback, in those games, their running backs had 30 rushing attempts, 5 targets, 5 receptions, and then in the following game in week 10, 22 rushing attempts, 4 targets, 4 receptions. We've seen that the Atlanta Falcons absolutely, without a doubt, want to utilize these running backs in this matchup against the Carolina Panthers. Even though the Carolina Panthers have a new defensive coordinator, they have a couple new personnel changes. Ultimately, a lot of their defense is still the same, and we're going to continue to see the Atlanta Falcons key in on running the ball and doing what they do best. Moving on, let's talk about Josh Jacobs, our number 6. Josh Jacobs takes on the Denver Broncos. Again, another division rival. Last season, in week 4 against this defense, he put up 32 fantasy points. 28 rushing attempts, 144 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 catches on 6 targets, 31 receiving yards, an unbelievable game, and was pretty much the launching point for the remainder of that season for Josh Jacobs, absolutely tearing apart the league. Now, in week 11, he had another crack at this defense, and even though he wasn't able to find the end zone, 24 rushing attempts, over 100 rushing yards, 3 catches, 51 receiving yards, 17.5 fantasy points. There has been a lot of production and a lot of opportunity in terms of overall touches, specifically 52 rushing attempts over the course of the last 2 games against this defense. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next running back. We have Saquon Barkley as our number 7. He takes on the Dallas Cowboys. Last season in week 3 against the Dallas Cowboys, 20.6 fantasy points, 14 attempts, 81 rushing yards, got himself a lot of utilization in the receiving game and had upside there, found the end zone. But then you go to week 12, Thanksgiving Day, and that game against the Dallas Cowboys. If you guys remember, I remember having the live stream and telling you guys, Saquon Barkley has 4 of his starting offensive linemen out today. I don't know if we're willing to play him. And even though that was the case, he still managed to put up 13.2 half PPR fantasy points without 4 of his starting offensive linemen ready to go on that given day. So I truly do believe, regardless of what is in front of Saquon Barkley, he's going to continue to get a lot of opportunity in this backfield because he is the offense. And as this offense has brought in weapons like Darren Waller, Paris Campbell, and Jalen Hyatt this offseason, it's only going to open it up for Saquon Barkley to find more success for fantasy purposes. All right, let's move on to our number 8. We have Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry in the last 3 seasons, week 1, has always been quiet. 8.2, 9.2, 14.6. It's not that the Tennessee Titans are slow to start. It's just a matter of they don't want to, typically throw 31 rushing attempts on the workload of Derrick Henry in week 1. So typically, we have seen them start slow. They do take on the New Orleans Saints, and even though the New Orleans Saints in seasons past, like 2020, 2021, they were significantly better in stopping the run. They were not great last year. Now, of course, they dealt with a lot of injuries. So if in fact they're healthy, they will probably be a better overall run stopping defense. That being said, we have a Tennessee Titans offense that, in comparison to last year, actually has receiving upside. We have DeAndre Hopkins, we have Treylon Burks, we have Chigoziem Okonkwo, all active and ready with Ryan Tannehill. That is only going to open up this offense, in my mind, and allow Derrick Henry to not have 8 men stuck in the box every single down, which will prevent him from obviously finding those gaps. He'll eventually go ahead and break out a couple big runs, but as long as they get him utilized in the receiving game as well, his overall upside will continue to maintain in this B tier for this week. Moving on to Aaron Jones, our number 9. Aaron Jones has always found success against the Chicago Bears. Now, the question is that because of Aaron Rodgers and how much success he has found? I think just looking back at last season's numbers, in terms of the week 2 matchup against Chicago, Aaron Jones scored 30.5 fantasy points in that game. 132 rushing yards on the ground on 15 attempts, had himself a rushing touchdown and a receiving touchdown. Now, when you go back to the week 13 matchup, last season, unfortunately, Aaron Jones in that contest left early with an injury, only played 38% of the offensive snaps. And because of the absence of Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon ended up scoring 19.4 fantasy points. But specifically, in the last 2 matchups against this defense, against the same defensive coordinator, very similar personnel. I know they've brought in a couple other members in order to, bolster the linebacking core of that defense. We've seen the running backs of the Green Bay Packers combine for 37.7 and 27.5 fantasy points in the last 2 games against the Chicago Bears. I'm expecting Aaron Jones to find a lot of success. Moving on to Joe Mixon, our number 10. Joe Mixon, of course, is going to get himself a lot of receiving work, but he's also going to get majority of the rushing attempts. When we go into this matchup against their division rival, the current over-under implication, that's the 3rd highest going into week 1. So we should potentially see a shootout between these 2 rivals. Now, specifically in the matchups last season in which we saw the Cincinnati Bengals take on the Cleveland Browns, Cincinnati running backs in the week 8 contest combined for 15.7 fantasy points, 13 targets and 11 receptions in that game for 68 receiving yards. Didn't do anything on the ground, only 9 attempts for 34 yards. And in the week 14 contest, the entire backfield was significantly better. 19 attempts for 120 rushing yards, still 8 targets, 4 receptions. There is going to be a lot of receiving upside, especially with Joe Burrow still working back from that calf injury. He's not going to be as mobile. He's going to be checking it down to Joe Mixon. We have seen Joe Mixon find himself a lot of success against this defense in the past. We're hoping for him to have himself a big week 1 to start off the 2023 season. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson, our number 11. Here's the fact of the matter. The Philadelphia Eagles are probably going to score a lot of points. Last season, they were number 1 amongst all teams in first half points per game. So if in fact they come out with a huge, first half and they immediately make an impact there, it is going to force the New England Patriots to most likely pass for a majority of the second half. Last season, from week 6 through 18, Rhamondre Stevenson had 72 total targets in the last 12 games of the season. That's 6 targets per game on average. If in fact Mac Jones continues to dump it off in his direction, his overall upside in terms of fantasy points, especially half PPR, full PPR, is only going to increase, along with the idea that he's going to get himself the rushing attempts and hopefully some work down in the red zone. Rhamondre Stevenson, again, proved last season, whenever he's given an ample set of opportunity, 15 plus touches, he's going to score about 15 to 16 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We're hoping for that in this given week. Moving on, let's talk about our number 12. It is Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne, without James Robinson last season, was a great player, averaging 18.33 touches per game, 13.68 fantasy points per game, and throughout that 12-game span without James Robinson, in 9 of those games was playing 70+% of the offensive snaps. Now, I understand last season against the Indianapolis Colts, their division rival, in both the games in which we saw the Jacksonville Jaguars take on this team, unfortunately, James Robinson was active in both contests. But when we kind of go ahead and get an idea as to what we're potentially going to see from Doug Peterson, the primary play caller of this offense, last season, the running backs for the Jaguars in those 2 contests combined for 32 rushing attempts for the first game, 15 rushing attempts for the second game. In the first game, 84 rushing yards, rushing touchdown, a total of 21.6 fantasy points as a backfield, while in the second game, 111 rushing yards, still found himself a rushing touchdown, 17.7 fantasy points. We know that this team wants to go ahead and utilize the rushing game, but truly, the way to find success this season against the Indianapolis Colts is going to be to attack their secondary. And with all the receiving threats we have seen, with this overall Jacksonville Jaguars offense, especially bringing in Calvin Ridley, that's where they're going to find majority of their success, because we know that the Indianapolis Colts still have great run-stopping defenders. So even though, Travis Etienne should have himself a pretty solid week, it's going to be off of the back of the receiving game, getting him into those advantageous positions. Moving on to our number 13, Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker takes on the LA Rams. The LA Rams defense is nothing like they were last season. I think they're, the second youngest team in the National Football League. I think all season long, we're going to probably get into a position where we want to start our running backs against the LA Rams. But we're going to go ahead and test that this week. Kenneth Walker, the last time he took on the LA Rams in week 18 of last season, 29 rushing attempts for 114 rushing yards, 12.9 fantasy points. Unfortunately, was not able to find the end zone. In week 13 against the LA Rams last season, got injured, only played 21% of the offensive snaps. So we only have one game of overall understanding as to what we could potentially see from Kenneth Walker. The fact that this team ran the ball as much as they did last season leads me to believe that even with Zach Charbonnet active in the lineup, and we don't know how much work and utilization Zach Charbonnet is going to kind of fill in for, how much snaps he's going to overall play. So if in fact the Seattle Seahawks continue to employ that run-first approach like they did back in 2021 against the LA Rams defense with 20 rushing attempts and 19 rushing attempts in those two contests against them, if they continue that going in the right direction, Kenneth Walker should absolutely find value with all the opportunities he is given. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Miles Sanders at number 14. He takes on the newly kind of, upgraded Atlanta Falcons. I guess we're going to have to wait and see whether it's an upgrade. They brought in a lot of members for that defense. They also hired a new defensive coordinator. He was the former co-defensive coordinator of the New Orleans Saints last season. So they have a little bit of a shift as to what their whole defense is going to look like. But when we go back to last season, specifically what the Carolina Panthers did against the Atlanta Falcons, and a lot of those Atlanta Falcons defenders are still there in terms of a structure of personnel. Last season, the Carolina Panthers backfield dominated, and so did the offensive line. And like I've mentioned in the past, 4 of the 5 starters for the Carolina Panthers offensive line are returning this season, and D'Onta Foreman absolutely cooked the Atlanta Falcons last season. I mean, the overall total contributions of those running backs in those two games, 34 rushing attempts for 146 and 3 touchdowns. And in the other game, 42 rushing attempts for 176 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. If in fact Miles Sanders is going to lock in, be the primary rusher and the 3-down back of this team, could find success. Maybe not at that caliber, but good enough to be an absolute starter as an RB2 candidate. Moving on. Let's talk about David Montgomery, the number 15 back. They take on, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs on Thursday Night Football. The current implied over-under of this game is the highest amongst all games in week 1, 54 total points. Again, when you go ahead and look back at what the Detroit Lions were accomplishing last season, throughout the entire year, they were averaging 25 running back rushing attempts per game. But specifically in the last 2 games of the season, when it mattered most, they were running the ball about 28 times per game with their running backs. Jamaal Williams was getting about 19 rushing attempts in those 2 contests. If we're anticipating David Montgomery to be the Jamaal Williams of this overall offense and pretty much taking over his role, and in the most important games of the season, they're giving him about 20 rushing attempts per game, I expect David Montgomery in a very important game to begin the season against the defending champs to be utilized greatly, mainly because, of course, Chris Jones, the all-pro defensive tackle of the Kansas City Chiefs, is not going to be there. He is dealing with a contract dispute, and in the last 2 games where the Kansas City Chiefs did not have Chris Jones in the lineup in 2021, they took on Washington in that game, gave up 19 attempts for 94 rushing yards, which is a 4.95 yard per carry average, and against the Los Angeles Chargers in that same season, 32 rushing attempts, 166 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown, giving up 5.19 yards per carry on average. I expect David Montgomery, currently his numbers of 48.5 rushing yards are far too low. I'd go higher on that number via Underdog Fantasy Pick'ems. Now, the other player I wanted to mention at number 16 is still another member of this Detroit Lions backfield. Like I just mentioned, with Chris Jones no longer there is going to be a high upside of this offense, specifically behind this incredible top-tier offensive line to run the ball with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. And they're both going to find success on the ground because without Chris Jones, really, this defense is a shell of themselves. Now, additionally, we have found specifically last season, the Kansas City Chiefs were giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs in the receiving game. Specifically, amongst their entire season stats, they gave up the 3rd most targets, 2nd most receptions, 4th most receiving yards to opposing running backs in the receiving game. So if in fact we're going to be in a situation where the Kansas City Chiefs, like they typically do, last season had the 2nd highest first half points per game average, if they're going to boat race the Detroit Lions and try to put up as many points as possible, it may force the Detroit Lions to have to throw the ball. And when they utilize Jahmyr Gibbs, whether it's out of the backfield or out wide, of course, he'll find himself a lot of receiving work as the number 2 receiving option of this offense, or at least my expectation is that going into the season. Moving on, let's talk about J.K. Dobbins. Okay, so J.K. Dobbins going into this matchup, in terms of what we're anticipating, again, last season, weeks 14 through the playoffs, he was averaging 15 touches per game and 13 fantasy points per game with a 6.56 yard per carry average, all with a limp. Now, if in fact we are assuming that he is going to be the lead running back, which of course that is probably going to be the case, I don't expect, Justice Hill and or Gus Edwards to take a huge workload of opportunity, because even last season in the games in which he returned, Gus Edwards was not really getting more than about 2 or 3 rushing attempts in those overall contests. At this current time, the overall spread of the game between the Ravens and the Houston Texans, the Baltimore Ravens are -10 going into this matchup. So if the assumption is going to be this team's going to take a lead and they're going to run the ball out and they're going to utilize J.K. Dobbins to run the ball in those scenarios, again, you got to remember the Houston Texans last season gave up the most points to opposing running backs on the ground on a per week basis on average. If we're pushing in the direction of isolated rushing statistics, that is exactly the category that J.K. Dobbins flourishes in. I think 58.5 rushing yards is not enough for what he's capable of. Moving on to our number 18, we have Cam Akers. Cam Akers, last season, in the 2 games in which he took on the Seattle Seahawks, luckily, both those games were when Cam Akers was just taking over the job in week 13. Again, you got to remember from weeks 13 through 18, he was averaging 16.77 fantasy points per game, on average about 17 rushing attempts and 85 rushing yards per game, and a rushing touchdown per game on average. Now, a lot of those statistics were accumulated against the Seattle Seahawks in the 2 matchups, putting up 18.5 and 14.3 fantasy points in those 2 contests. Specifically, in week 18 against Seattle, played 100% of the offensive snaps and was getting himself a lot of utilization in the receiving game throughout that time on a per game average from weeks 13 through 18, running about 22 routes per game. So if Cooper Kupp's going to miss time this week, and of course Matthew Stafford's going to have to get the ball out of his hands because of his offensive line falling apart, Cam Akers in the receiving game has more upside. Moving on, let's talk about Najee Harris. So Najee Harris going into this week takes on, unfortunately, the San Francisco 49ers. The San Francisco 49ers, amongst all defenses last season, were number 1 in terms of allowing fantasy points to opposing running backs, meaning they allowed the fewest points. On top of that, they also were only allowing 3.3 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs, which was the best in the league. I mean, they're an unstoppable defense, and I truly do believe they only got better this offseason by bringing in a couple of the members. Well, obviously, they brought in that Philadelphia defensive lineman. In terms of overall personnel, they're only improving. We're expecting Nick Bosa to be signed, sealed, and delivered and ready to go for this matchup. Even though this is all the case, you have to start your studs. And in this current scenario, Najee Harris is a stud running back. I mean, you look back at weeks 16 through 18 of last season when he was healthy. 20 touches per game on average, and 13.41 fantasy points per game on average. They've upgraded their offensive line, and by upgrading your offensive line and having more experience under the belt of the quarterback, I do expect this overall offense to take steps forward and make this a competitive game. Even with how difficult the overall kind of run-stopping defense is for the San Francisco 49ers, there are still going to be opportunities for Najee Harris in the running game and even in the receiving game to find himself opportunity to be a fantasy relevant back. That's why I've moved him down to number 19. It's very similar to last season, Ezekiel Elliott week 1 taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It is very difficult to kind of assume immediate success in those scenarios. Moving on, let's talk about our number 20. We have Khalil Herbert. So Khalil Herbert takes on the Green Bay Packers. Many of you guys have asked me over the course of the last couple weeks already, kind of preemptively thinking, hey, should I start Khalil Herbert against Green Bay? Because it's a great matchup. And again, like we know, the Green Bay Packers have not been great in terms of stopping the run over the last couple seasons. Specifically last year, Khalil Herbert taking on the Green Bay Packers, even though he wasn't given much opportunity because David Montgomery was dominating the snaps and the touches. In the 2 games, he had 7 total rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards, which is an 8.4 yard per carry average. Now, that kind of number is not unfamiliar to Khalil Herbert, considering the amount of success he found last season and how highly efficient he was in the opportunities he was given. You got to remember, in the last 2 seasons, in games in which Khalil Herbert has 12 or more touches, averaging 15.11 fantasy points per game, and in games in which he's playing 50% or more of the offensive snaps, averaging 14.97 fantasy points per game. Specifically last season in the games against Green Bay where David Montgomery was the lead back, Montgomery was dominating, specifically the rushing statistics, 15 attempts, 122 yards in that first game. In the second game, 14 attempts, 61 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. 14.6 fantasy points, 14.7 fantasy points. I'm expecting success from Khalil Herbert this week. Moving on, let's talk about Dameon Pierce. So like I mentioned earlier with J.K. Dobbins, in terms of going into this week, the Houston Texans are the biggest underdog amongst all teams in the National Football League. They are a plus 10 favorite. People are expecting them to lose by double-digit points potentially going into this week, and that really shouldn't be a surprise considering who's on the other side of the ball, the Baltimore Ravens. Now, at this current moment in time, via Underdog Fantasy and their pick'ems, Dameon Pierce is sitting at 51.5 rushing yards, which kind of gives us an implication as to what people are thinking his overall production upside looks like, especially considering their starting center and their starting left guard are both out for this game. They're both on the injured reserve, which is obviously going to have a slow start to Dameon Harris's season. and that's absolutely going to make an impact, even though their left guard last season, according to Pro Football Focus, was the lowest graded overall run blocking offensive guard. And of course, their center is a rookie, so we don't really know what kind of an impact he was going to make. If you can go ahead and plug in those holes with decent offensive linemen that can get the job done, we know what Dameon Pierce is capable of. Last season, in games in which he plays 50% or more of the offensive snaps, averaging 12.25 fantasy points per game, 17 rushing attempts per game. But now we have a new regime within this overall offense. We're hoping for Dameon Pierce to be relevant. I still think he can manage to be an RB2 in a difficult matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Raheem Mostert. Currently, with the situation of Jeff Wilson Jr. on the injured reserve and Etienne returning from his shoulder injury, there may be a situation in which Raheem Mostert is the lone back in this backfield. Now, I do expect Etienne to play this week, but again, he may even be on a pitch count because they don't want him to mess up that AC shoulder sprain and go ahead and potentially miss even further time because he's only just getting back from that injury. So going into this upcoming week, with Raheem Mostert expected to get majority of the rushing attempts against the Los Angeles Chargers, this is the second highest implied over-under with 51 total points expected in this given matchup. This should be a high-scoring event, and my expectation is that Raheem Mostert should probably fall into the end zone. Regardless of what he does on the ground or through the air, he should be able to find success. He took on this team back in Week 14 of last season, and even though they weren't able to find much success as an offense, you have to remember that this is a game that they lost 17-23. And Tua Tagovailoa started that game 0 for 11 passing and finished that game 10 for 28 passing. Tua had one of his worst, if not the worst game of his entire career, and they still only lost by 6 points against the Los Angeles Chargers in that game. I truly do expect to see this offense continue to utilize in the rushing game because of the fact that they weren't able to get the passing game going in this matchup last season. They had to completely abandon the rushing game because they were down so many points early on. I'm anticipating Raheem Mostert to find himself an impact against a defense that really hasn't been great in terms of stopping the run over the last couple of years. Moving on, Alexander Mattison is our number 23. Alexander Mattison, of course, within an offense with Kevin O'Connell, you got to remember, Kevin O'Connell used to be the offensive coordinator for the Rams from 2020 through 2021. They took on Todd Bowles, the head coach / defensive coordinator of the Bucs, 3 times throughout that span of time. The Rams utilized Goff for 51 passing attempts, 376 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. Stafford, 38 attempts, 343, 4 touchdowns. Stafford again in the playoffs, 38 attempts, 366, 2 passing touchdowns. Going into this upcoming week, I'm expecting the Minnesota Vikings to pass the ball a bunch because that is exactly what Kevin O'Connell as an offensive coordinator of the Rams did up against Todd Bowles and his defense. And what has worked in the past will probably work once again. Like we were saying last season, Kevin O'Connell wants to make Justin Jefferson the Cooper Kupp of this offense. He did that and more. And going into this upcoming week, I'm expecting a lot of success, especially considering Tampa Bay is typically great in terms of stopping the run. Last season, they only allowed 100+ rushing yards from opposing offenses in 3 separate games. They allowed less than 80 rushing yards in 12 of their overall 17 games. I'm expecting Alexander Mattison to be decent, but his overall upside is going to be contingent on this offense finding success, getting the ball into the red zone, and pushing him into the end zone. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 24, Isiah Pacheco, taking on the Detroit Lions. Isiah Pacheco last season, in games in which he played 40% or more of the offensive snaps, averaged 15 touches per game and 11.64 fantasy points per game. He was able to do that in 10 contests. Now, the reason why I mentioned this is because going into this upcoming week, we have the return of Clyde Edwards-Helaire back into the rotation and, of course, Jerick McKinnon. So all of the receiving work is pretty much out of the realm of opportunity for Isiah Pacheco because we know Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire are better receiving backs than him. So as long as Pacheco kind of maintains his rushing role and is going to get back to his heroics from 2022 and be the primary rusher of this team, with the fact that this is the game that is the highest implicated over-under in terms of overall points with like 56, if we're going to get anywhere close to that number, we may find Isiah Pacheco falling into the end zone, and even with 40, 50 rushing yards, can absolutely be an RB2 in this given week. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Swift. Now, DeAndre Swift's current overall number in terms of pick'ems via Underdog Fantasy is 36.5 rushing yards. That pretty much means that we're expecting Rashad Penny and Kenneth Walker to be utilized in this offense enough to where it is going to impact DeAndre Swift. Let me just put this into a kind of perspective. DeAndre Swift, when healthy in his career, over the course of the last couple seasons, whenever he has played 50% or more percentage of the offensive snaps, he's averaging over 14 fantasy points per game. And that was, of course, with all the receiving work. If we're not going to see DeAndre Swift utilizing the receiving game within this offense, but at least get himself opportunities in the red zone, he absolutely can be an RB2. It's just a matter of how much Rashad Penny, Kenneth Gainwell, we're going to see utilized in terms of snap counts and in the rotation. And once we've kind of gone ahead and established that after week 1, then we can kind of get an idea as to whether or not we're starting DeAndre Swift. moving forward. Moving on, let's talk about Bijan Robinson Jr., starting running back of the Washington Commanders. So Bijan Robinson has himself a great opportunity primarily because they take on the Arizona Cardinals. The Commanders, according to Vegas, are a 7-point favorite going into this game. They're the second highest favorite besides, of course, the Baltimore Ravens against the Houston Texans. So my expectation is the game script is going to lean in the direction of the Washington Commanders running the ball. Bijan Robinson last season, weeks 5 through 16, averaged 16 rushing attempts per game, 65 rushing yards per game, and 9.05 fantasy points per game. If, in fact, this is going to be an easy walk in the park, going up against the Arizona Cardinals, who have a rookie quarterback by the name of Clayton Tune, this should be a matchup in which Washington's getting the ball back often. They're running the ball. They're finding success on the ground, and especially with Bijan Robinson scoring fantasy points. Moving on, we have Rachaad White as our 27. Now, I'm a little bit concerned about Rachaad White, and I'll tell you why. Last season, even despite the fact that Rachaad White was relevant from weeks 10 through the playoffs, averaging 12 rushing attempts per game, 4 receptions per game, and 10.39 fantasy points per game. And in his one singular start without Leonard Fournette in the lineup, he got himself 15.4 fantasy points, 15 rushing attempts, and 9 receptions in that overall contest, despite all of his overall upside that he has proven and the fact that he is going to most likely be a 3-down back in this offense. Even though Sean Tucker is going to be the number 2 rotating in here and there, it is going to be tough because the run-stopping force of the Minnesota Vikings is truly improved this offseason. They've brought in a lot of great personnel that is going to be able to help stop the run. That is probably going to continue to lead towards Rachaad White having more receiving work in a matchup where this team is going to be in a negative game script, having to throw for majority of the second half. And when that's the case, Rachaad White in a full PPR certainly has more value, but in a half PPR, I think he's an RB3 going into this given week. Moving on to James Conner. Similar situation. Going up against the Washington Commanders front 7, I mean, just think about their defensive line. Young, Allen, Payne, and Sweat. Those 4 defensive linemen are going to be a nightmare for Clayton Tune. And if, in fact, this offense isn't able to mount a lead and they're going to be in a negative game script for a majority of the overall game, especially with a statue of a quarterback, Clayton Tune in his final year at college had like 100 rushing attempts for 165 rushing yards. Did not really do much in Houston. So going into this week, despite the fact that James Conner has been incredible whenever Kyler Murray has not been in the game, averaging 16.34 fantasy points per game in the last 9 games without Kyler Murray, I still believe that Connor's going to purely have to depend on receiving work and somehow finding the end zone. I think the end zone may be out of the realm of possibility unless they find, a lucky pass down the field in which his defense falls apart. Outside of that, I'm hoping for a lot of receiving work and upside from James Conner in this given matchup. Moving on, let's talk about James Cook. James Cook is pretty much in a tough matchup. The last 2 times that the Buffalo Bills took on the New York Jets, the Buffalo Bills pretty much abandoned the rushing game and had to continue to utilize their running backs in the receiving game. In Week 9's contest last season, their running backs combined for 12 rushing attempts, 39 rushing yards. In Week 14's contest, 13 rushing attempts, 48 rushing yards. But as a combined total of those 2 games, 14 passing attempts to their overall running backs in terms of targets. So if, in fact, we're going to see this offense have to avoid the running game because of how incredible the New York Jets run stop is, even with Dameon Harris and Latavius Murray and, of course, the rushing efforts of Josh Allen, I truly do think that James Cook is going to maintain on the field because of the heavy passing threat he's going to have to be in order to unlock this offense and help them find success in this given week. Moving on. A.J. Dillon's number 30. Like I mentioned earlier, and the reason why I have someone like Aaron Jones ranked so high, in week 2 of last season against the Chicago Bears, despite the fact that we saw Aaron Jones score 30.5 fantasy points, A.J. Dillon had a lot of opportunity. In fact, A.J. Dillon had 18 rushing attempts for 61 rushing yards and 3 targets, 1 catch, 6 receiving yards, and 6.7 half PPR fantasy points. In terms of overall opportunity, 18 rushing attempts is no joke. The following game against the Chicago Bears in week 13, again, 18 rushing attempts, 93 rushing yards this time, and a rushing touchdown. Obviously benefited from the fact that Aaron Jones left that game early with an injury. But I truly do believe the volume at which this team is going to run the ball with Jordan Love under center against Chicago, which have struggled in terms of stopping the run, specifically last year, and their defensive coordinator is the same. I'm expecting success from A.J. Dillon for sure. Moving on, let's talk about Antonio Gibson. In conjunction with Bijan Robinson, they both should find success. Now, last season with Bijan Robinson in the lineup, from weeks 5 through 16, Antonio Gibson was averaging 8.73 attempts per game and 3.0 receptions per game. So just barely over 11 touches per game, getting himself into the conversation of 8.82 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. If, in fact, this game is going to be highly dependent on this team just playing defense, getting the ball back and running it down the throat of the defenders, Antonio Gibson is going to be in the mix there. Bijan Robinson isn't going to be the only running back rushing the ball on a consistent basis. We'll see more opportunities for Antonio Gibson. And of course, as the expected third down back of this team with no more J.D. McKissic, Antonio Gibson should be getting himself a good volume of touches and fantasy points in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Javonte Williams. Here begins all of the running backs that are going to be on a pitch count or are in a situation where they're replacing someone from a suspension. We begin with Javonte Williams, who, again, we got a quote from earlier today from Sean Payton. When asked about Javonte Williams, he said, "He's one, but there are a few players that we now have to pay attention to who may not have the volume compared to others." Now, specifically, they're kind of talking about there being a potential pitch count for Javonte Williams. He continued to talk about how, they've thought about it, but they haven't talked about it in the meeting yet as of this week as to how much they're going to utilize Javonte Williams. I'm expecting Javonte Williams to be limited, of course, coming off the ACL and LCL last season. They have Samaje Perine. They built this team in terms of bringing in offensive personnel with 2 new starting offensive linemen, a great run blocking tight end, and of course, Samaje Perine for a reason. So those guys are probably going to get a lot of utilization. They're going to run the ball as much as they can, keep the ball out of, Russell Wilson from cooking the game in the wrong direction. Even with all this being the case, Javonte Williams did prove in week 2 of the preseason, he played 12 offensive snaps. In those 12 offensive snaps, had 8 opportunities and 7 touches, 3 rushing attempts for 12 rushing yards, 4 receptions for 18 receiving yards. There is potential for Javonte Williams to get in the rotation, but he's not going to be the full workload back in the given week. Moving on, Dalvin Cook, another one of these players. So I want to go ahead and pop up both Dalvin Cook and Breece Hall because I got to talk about them both at the same time, considering they are within the same backfield. As of this morning, we got a quote from Robert Saleh, the head coach of the New York Jets, saying, "I don't know if I want to call it a snap count, but we're going to be smart with them," in regards to both Dalvin Cook and Breece Hall. Of course, Dalvin Cook coming off the shoulder injury, and of course, Breece Hall with the ACL. Then he further went on to say, Robert Saleh, "Michael Carter's a really good football player, just trying to find ways to feature them all." That in itself begins to scare me. So if in fact we're going to get a pitch count for both, Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook, on top of the fact that Michael Carter's going to be in the rotation, it does not bode well for their overall fantasy upside in this given week, especially considering Dalvin Cook only just joined the organization, still needs to find his legs. Even though Dalvin Cook last season with the Vikings against the Bills put up 22.1 fantasy points, 14 attempts for 119 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, had a monster game, I don't expect him to have that kind of production because he is going to be limited to, extent. Additionally, last season in the 2 games in which the New York Jets took on the Buffalo Bills, they ran the ball a lot. 27 rushing attempts for 141 in week 9, 22 rushing attempts for 76 in week 14. In both those games, a rushing touchdown. They found a lot of success, and that's how they've kept these games close. Very close, in fact. I mean, those games have been 1-score games, so we may not see as much Dalvin Cook or Breece Hall as we'd like, but they may get enough to still be relevant in a top 36 capacity. Moving on, let's talk about Deon Jackson. Of course, he'll be filling in for not only Jonathan Taylor, but expected to fill in for Zach Moss. There is a possibility in which Zach Moss returns from the forearm fracture that he went ahead and incurred during the preseason training camp. But if in fact he doesn't return, Deon Jackson will be the lead back. Deon Jackson last season, in games in which he played 32% of the offensive snaps or more, or had 14 or more touches, was averaging 12.58 fantasy points per game. He took on the Jacksonville Jaguars last season in week 6, has the privilege of taking them on this week. 12 attempts for 42 rushing yards, not the greatest average, but it's okay. A rushing touchdown, 10 targets, 10 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 23.1 fantasy points. We know he can absolutely be a 3-down back, and that's what we're expecting. But the question is, how much Evan Hull are we going to see? How much Anthony Richardson are we going to see in terms of rushing? We'll go ahead and wait and see whether or not Zach Moss is active, but otherwise Deon Jackson could be of value to us this week. Moving on, the final option I wanted to mention is someone else that is moving in and filling in for a suspension. It is Jamaal Williams for the New Orleans Saints. He will be filling in for Alvin Kamara, of course, suspended for 3 games. Last season, Jamaal Williams made his name off of the back of the touchdowns he was scoring and behind an offensive line that was absolutely leading him to success. That being said, in only 7 of his games last season, 7 of his 17 games, he averaged over 4 yards per carry. In 10 of those games, it was less than 4 yards per carry on average in terms of his rushing attempts. Overall, when you take on the Tennessee Titans in a given week and you have a running back that is highly inefficient in an offense that does not have to just give him the ball in order to find rushing success because they have Kendre Miller and they also have Taysom Hill, you got to remember the Tennessee Titans last season were the best defense in terms of yards allowed against opposing running backs, only allowing 3.39 yard per carry average against opposing running backs in 2022. A lot of their personnel is back. Their defensive coordinator is there and ready to go ahead and stop Jamaal Williams finding any sort of success in the rushing category. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you guys have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel. Click the like button down below. Of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit to get my rankings to stay up to date on my latest content for the entirety of the season. If you enjoyed today's content, I'll be back tomorrow with wide receiver rankings at a top 36 capacity. Wednesday, we'll talk about both tight end and quarterback rankings. And Thursday, I'll have a live stream prior to the kickoff of the 2023 season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.